In this exercise, I'm going to introduce you to this panel right there, the Layers panel. And the reason I'm showing it to you so early in the process here is because it is integral to the drawing process inside of Illustrator. For those of you who are familiar with Photoshop, you know how important the Layers panel is. It's twice that important here inside of Illustrator because it not only shows you all of your layers, but it shows you every single object on your page. And I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. And you can name each and every object, and you can assemble groups and drag things into groups and out of them and change layers. There's no end to what you can do. And you can even, by the way, select tricky objects, things that are hard to get to. For example, let's say I want to select this heart outline inside of this illustration called loveadobeanstyle.ai. Well, then you can go ahead and grab yourself the black arrow tool. Illustrator calls it the selection tool. I call it the black arrow because I don't think the selection tool really tells the full story, as we'll see. And then I would just go ahead and hover over this path outline. Notice I hover over the center of it. And as soon as I do, then I see that I've got something under my cursor. And the way I know I have something under my cursor is there's that tiny square right next to the arrow. So I see no square over here. I do see a square at this point. I click and I go ahead and select that heart independently of all the other objects. However, if I try to click on one of the outlines inside of this target, I don't seem to be able to select it. And in fact, what I'm doing is I'm selecting the item that's already selected at this point. Whereas if I dig into the Layers panel, I can easily select this object. Now, I have to say, there's ways to do it out here in the illustration window, and we will visit the myriad ways throughout the various chapters in the series. However, oftentimes, especially when you're first learning the program, if you only knew you could do it so easily inside the Layers panel, that would have saved you so much grief. So make sure that the Layers panel is open, and you can get to it by going to the Window menu and choosing the Layers command or pressing the F7 key. That's the same key that gets you the Layers panel inside of Photoshop and many of the other Adobe applications as well, incidentally. So once you're inside the Layers panel, you'll see two layers. One's called One and Only, and that contains the actual drawing. And then we have the Guides layer down here, which contains a series of guidelines. Right now, the guides are hidden, but you can view them by going to the View menu and choosing Guides, and then choosing this command right there, Show Guides. And by the way, to show and hide the guides, you can also press this keyboard shortcut, which I suggest you remember, even though it's weird, of Control semicolon, Command semicolon on the Mac. Again, that works throughout the Adobe application. So learn it once and you know it elsewhere. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and choose that command, and now we can see the guides that are located on this Guides layer. I'm going to twirl open Guides by clicking on the little twirly triangle right there, and that expands the Guides layer so we can see its contents. And notice there are 4 sets of guides in this particular graphic. And you can turn the guides on and off just by clicking on their eyeballs. Notice when I turned off the eyeball for the bottom guide, I got rid of this rectangular guide that occurred in the bottom right quadrant inside of this illustration. And then the next guide up is the one over on the right-hand side, so upper right. And then this one is located in the lower left. And then finally, we've got the top guide, which happens to be upper left, which means now that I know that, I could go ahead and name these guides so I don't have to do that work again. So I could double-click on the top guide, and I could go ahead and call him top left, like so, click OK, and then this one here is bottom left. Now, unfortunately, what would be nice, by the way, is if I didn't have to double click on each one of these guys to bring up a dialog box, but I could name them right there inside the panel. That, however, does not work. You do have to work inside of a dialog box inside of Illustrator, and this guy is bottom right. So now I know exactly where they're located, and if I feel like they're kind of ordered wrong, then I could drag bottom left down below top right, like so. Now, that's not going to change the physical appearance of the guidelines here inside the illustration, but that will help to tidy things up. Now, it's more than just being fastidious. You can entertain yourself for hours. If you're the kind of person who loves to clean your sock drawer, why, then you can have all kinds of fun here inside the Layers panel. Moreover, though, the reason you're really doing this is because somebody else might follow along in your footsteps, and they might like to know what in the world's going on inside of your graphic. And you don't have to name each and every object. That would be insane. But you might want to name some key pivotal objects. And then finally, what about you? You visit this illustration a year or 2 years in the future, you're going to forget everything about it, I guarantee you. And if you leave the equivalent of a few breadcrumbs inside of your illustrations to follow along, that'll make life a lot easier. All right, I'm going to twirl guys close. I'm going to twirl open one and only, and you can see how I've really tidied things up inside of the illustration. We got the arrow inside of one group, so I can turn it off. Sure enough, that is that arrow. Turn it back on. And then we've got the heart, and as I say, we're going to be able to select better inside of it in just a moment. And finally, we've got the spirals. These guys are the spirals underneath the heart, and we're seeing the objects in the order that they appear. So in other words, spirals is at the bottom of the layer, heart is on top of it, and arrow is on top of that. So we can just see the stacking order right there in front of us. Now, if I twirl open heart, notice that there's this thing called a clipping mask, which is the heart shape itself, and that's more or less what we have selected. At least that's where we're seeing selected, but we actually have the entire thing selected, both the clipping mask and the target. And the clipping mask is something that masks something else. So in other words, we're masking the target inside of a heart. But if I just want to select the target, all I have to do is click on this little target right there, which, by the way, Adobe calls a meatball. So when you click on a meatball, or if you prefer, when you meatball the object, it's also a verb, then you go ahead and select that item here inside of the illustration. And if you were to twirl that open, you could see that there's more stuff inside that you can get to. So that just gives you a sense of how useful this layers panel is. Now, I was saying in a previous chapter, I really like to work with these big previews inside of the layers panel. And you can achieve those big previews by going over to the flyout menu icon, clicking on it, choosing panel options like so, and then switching your row size to other and entering in a large size. So I tend to enter sizes between 50 and 75 typically, and then click OK. Now, in our case, we don't need to do it because that information is saved along with the illustration. But what if you want to do that for every illustration you create? Well, I'm going to answer that very question in the next exercise.